So, in today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at Dr. William Lane Craig, the bane and scourge of atheists everywhere. And specifically, we're going to be looking at 8 arguments that he advances for the existence of God. And we're going to be looking at clips that were taken from a debate that he held with the philosopher of science, Alex Rosenberg. There is nothing particularly special about this debate. If you go and have a look at any of the debates that William Lane Craig participates in, he uses basically the same arguments. In fact, as far as I can tell, he's been using basically the same stump speech on this issue for about 30 years. So what he does is basically advance these arguments in support of the existence of God. And what I'm going to do with you today is to just run through each of these arguments and discuss, of course, some of the problems with them, why I don't believe that these succeed as arguments. But I will make it clear from the outset that I don't consider this to be a full rebuttal of William Lane Craig's position. So Craig is a very serious philosopher. He has published a great many philosophical articles in respected philosophical journals. He's written many books on these issues, so I'm sure that a lot of the issues that I raise here today, Craig will have already heard in some kind of form. He's probably responded to them in some way, so I'm not going to begin with this arrogant assumption that some random Australian guy with a microphone is going to be able to play 45-second long clips of William Lane Craig and, thoroughly destroy his position. Rather, I just thought it'd be interesting to explore some of these arguments that Craig makes, and some of these are pretty common arguments for the existence of God. And just to give you some of my insights into why I think these arguments fail. Okay, so let's get straight into it. So here is the first argument that Craig offers, and that is that God is the best explanation for why anything at all exists.
The explanation of the universe can lie only in a transcendent reality, beyond the universe, beyond space and time, which is metaphysically necessary in its existence. Now, there's only one way I can think of to get a contingent universe from a necessarily existing cause, and that is if the cause is a personal agent who can freely choose to create a contingent reality. It therefore follows that the best explanation of the existence of the contingent universe is a transcendent personal being.
Okay, so a few things to address here. So the first problem that we've got is that Craig is using a number of fuzzily defined terms drawn largely from scholastic philosophy or the Christian philosophical tradition. And I did an earlier episode on why a priori arguments for God fail, and I talked about some of these issues there. So the first problem is that when you're invoking issues like transcendence, contingency, necessity, it's not absolutely clear what these refer to. So certainly there is nothing in the world of science which these terms can be said to denote. We have investigated reality at very deep levels, and there is no place in any kind of cosmology, in any kind of fundamental physics, for these categories like transcendence, contingency, and necessity. So here, of course, in everyday language, it's clear enough what these terms are supposed to denote, but when we are examining reality at its most fundamental levels, knowing more or less what these terms refer to is not going to cut it. There has to be a very clear definition of what is referred to by transcendence, contingency, necessity, causality, and so on. Because as far as we know, according to findings in quantum mechanics, there really isn't a place for any of these categories in that most fundamental level of physics. And particularly here we can focus on the word transcendent. So this is a very slippery word, so literally transcendent could just mean above and beyond. So if we're talking about a transcendent cause for the existence of the universe, what that might simply mean is that if there is a cause for the universe, then that cause must somehow exist beyond or outside the universe, and I think that makes perfect sense. But of course, Craig is selecting this term transcendent because it does have a specifically theological meaning, which points towards a kind of divine or supernatural realm. But if all we're saying is that the cause of the universe, if there is one, has to be outside the universe itself, then there's no reason to use this word transcendent, and there's no reason why naturalistic or physical causes could not be invoked, presuming that they existed beyond our current pocket of space-time. So at the very least here, Craig is going to have to really be very specific about what he means by transcendent, and why it would be that this cause has to be supernatural in that sense, rather than, as I said, a kind of natural physical process that just exists beyond our current confines of space and time. I'll also here draw your attention to the way that Craig here, and I think this is true of theists generally, will stampede to talk of causality and causes and so on, when again, when we're talking about the origin of the universe, why something exists, causality might not be the most useful way or the most accurate way to talk about this process. So the first problem is, of course, going to be that causality implies typically some kind of temporal priority. So that means that the cause of something happens before the effect happens in time. But here, when we are talking about the very creation of space-time itself, it's a little bit unclear what a cause of the universe might refer to in this sense, because we would have to be talking about something that occurs prior to the beginning of time. And so, again, I'm not exactly sure what that would mean. Now, Craig sidesteps this. He doesn't talk about this here, but I know from listening to other lectures of his and reading papers of his that he rejects this notion of causality as necessitating temporal priority. So he would say that causes and effects can actually be simultaneous or atemporal. Fine, I don't have the tools to argue with that viewpoint, frankly, but we should at least be clear that in this case, Craig is depending on a fairly idiosyncratic conception of causality, one which runs against common intuitions about how causality works. So it's important to at least be aware of that. But even deeper than that, so when cosmologists try to come up with explanations for the existence of the universe, they're not really talking about it in causal terms. So certainly at the quantum level, what exactly is meant by causality is very unclear. In fact, many quantum physicists are happy to do away with this notion of causality altogether, at least at the quantum level, because none of the equations seem to demand such a process that one thing causes another thing, but rather what they're going to be looking for are other kinds of explanations. So in addition to things like causal explanations, we can also look for things like grounding explanations, mathematical explanations, which still serve to explain why and how it is that something exists, but which don't depend on this notion of causality. So if, for example, I want to explain why it is impossible to distribute 7 apples evenly between 2 people, the explanation here is a mathematical one, and it's not as though the laws of arithmetic are causing it to be impossible to split the apples evenly. That would be a very strange way of looking at it. Rather, it's just simply a mathematical fact that 7 cannot go into 2, and that explains why it is that I can't distribute 7 apples to 2 people. Or if I want to explain what it is that makes something hot, I can, or rather I must, of course, point to molecular motion. But critically here, molecular motion doesn't cause heat. It's not a causal explanation of what's happening. Rather, we say that heat is grounded in molecular motion, or even simply that it just is molecular motion. So here, this is still a good explanation for what makes something hot. Something is hot because the molecules in that object are somehow very excited. But again, critically, it's not a causal explanation. So my argument here would be that when cosmologists explore the nature of the universe and how it is that the universe exists, they're not necessarily going to be dependent on causal explanations. They might look for things like mathematical or grounding explanations instead. Now, again, I'm not a cosmologist, I don't know exactly how this works, but when a cosmologist is developing a model for the creation of the universe, what they are basically trying to do is to identify some particular pattern or structure which would permit the emergence of the universe. But what's important here is that this mathematical pattern or structure is not causing the universe to exist. It's not like you just had these latent principles floating around in a void and eventually they came together to cause the universe. Rather, they're simply looking for particular mathematical facts, particular ontic structures, which would serve as the grounding for the existence of the universe. So here, when Craig insists that there must be a cause for the universe, that's already a pretty dubious claim for all of these reasons. But the reason that he, of course, goes for this kind of explanation, and the reason why causal explanations are so favoured by theists, relates to what I talked about in my very first episode on this channel concerning the nature of religious concepts, where there I argued that it's something called reification, which more than anything else serves as the basis for religious concepts. So with conceptual reification, what is basically happening is we are taking some kind of process or some kind of property or some kind of event, something like this, which is otherwise largely intangible, and we are basically treating it as a physical object, as a physical process, as a kind of thing. So when a theist invokes a causal explanation for something, or demands a causal explanation for something, this is to their advantage because when you invoke causal relationships, these are best understood as relationships between basically physical, really existing things, and they are much easier to understand than more abstract processes would be by themselves. So when a theist demands an answer to a question like what is the cause of the universe, that's a question that they're going to demand an answer to because causality implies this basically physical process in which you have something, in this case it would be God, that stands in a causal relationship that exerts a real physical force over the things that happen. And so by insisting on causality, the very question itself points in the direction of, well, if not God, then certainly some kind of supernatural thing which stands in a causal relationship to everything else. But as we've said, we don't necessarily need to accept this premise. We don't need to accept that the universe, strictly speaking, had a cause. And if we assume that the universe didn't have a cause, then there's nothing left for God to do. It's a kind of otiose concept in the scheme of things. Now, the other main problem with this argument of Craig's, at least as it's presented here, is that there are some pretty clear leaps in logic that need to be kind of justified and explained. So here he's basically going from this notion that the universe must have a cause, then suggesting this cause must be somehow transcendent, and then suggesting that this transcendent cause must also be a personal being. So I think all of those leaps are pretty dubious. We'll come to that second part in the next section. So one important thing to recognize with Craig's arguments for God is they're a kind of cumulative case, so each one sort of builds on the last, and it's difficult to understand this first argument without also understanding the second argument. So we'll talk about that second argument in a moment, that is Craig's rationale for why this transcendent cause has to be a personal being. But let's finish off this first section just by quickly exploring what it is that Craig means by transcendent cause here, and whether we should accept his demand that if the universe has a cause, which, as we've said, would already be a pretty big concession to Craig, why it is we should assume that this cause should be at all transcendent. So, as far as I can tell, Craig never really explains this leap in logic in this lecture, but I know from reading him in other places that he suggests this cause has to be transcendent, in the sense that it has to be beyond space and time, so it has to be something non-physical and atemporal, and that's because what we are seeking to explain is the very creation of temporality and space in the first place. So it makes sense then that whatever caused the universe to exist must be outside of space and time, and therefore it must be transcendent in this supernatural sense of not existing within the bounds of space and time. So we can't really point to a kind of physicalist cause for the creation of the universe, it has to be something supernatural. Now, even if we grant Craig this, and again, that would be an incredibly big concession, there's no reason to expect that whatever is the proximate cause of the universe has to be something exotic, has to be something with which we have no familiarity in this universe. So we could, for example, just posit some kind of energy, some kind of quantum field, something like this. So if there is such a thing responsible for the creation of the universe, it's not going to be something we can necessarily recognizably find in the universe, but it's at least going to have parallels. It's going to be a kind of dumb, mechanistic process, much like every other process we have so far been able to discover in the universe. So we certainly don't have to accept this claim that the cause for the universe has to be transcendent in a supernatural sense, but even if we grant it, there's still no particularly good reason to expect that supernatural cause to be a kind of personal agent, or indeed to possess any of the properties typically ascribed to the Christian God. So again, this will be the topic of the next section, but here, all I need to say is that even if we do require a supernatural cause for the universe, there are any number of religious concepts which are non-agential in nature, that is, they do not require the existence of a kind of personal being. So anything from like Tao in Taoism, or Li in Confucianism, or Dharma or Brahman in Hinduism, all of these would kind of serve as a supernatural grounding principle which could be posited as the proximate cause of why the universe exists, but none of these are personal beings in the sense that Craig intends. So even if we accept Craig's insistence that the cause of the universe has to be supernatural, there are any number of concepts that we might appeal to instead of Craig's conception of a personal God. So here now is Craig's second argument for the existence of God. As I've said, it flows on from this one. And that is that God is the best explanation of the origin of the universe. So here is what he has to say about that.
We can summarize our argument thus far as follows. 1, the universe began to exist. 2, if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a transcendent cause. 3, therefore, the universe has a transcendent cause. By the very nature of the case, that cause must be a transcendent, immaterial being. Now, there are only 2 possible things that could fit that description. Either an abstract object, like a number, or an unembodied mind or consciousness. But abstract objects don't stand in causal relations. The number 7, for example, has no effect on anything. Therefore, the cause of the universe is plausibly an unembodied mind or person. And thus we are brought not merely to a transcendent cause of the universe, but to its personal creator.
So here we have the justification, such that it is, for why this transcendent cause has to be a personal being. So the argument here is pretty flimsy, I think. So the way it's presented, it's as though there's a kind of dichotomy. There are only two possible things that can exist that are immaterial. So we have abstract objects like mathematical objects, and we have minds. So, of course, abstract concepts do not stand in any kind of causal relationship to anything. They don't have any effect on anything that happens. So the only remaining possibility for what this transcendent cause could be is a kind of mind. So firstly, as we've said, this is something of a false dichotomy. There are any number of supernatural concepts we could appeal to from the world's religious traditions, which would explain why the universe came into being, which can serve as the proximate cause of the universe existing, but which are not in any sense minds. So I'm not sure by what criteria Craig would be able to rule out Tao or Brahman or karma or anything else as the cause of the universe, because these concepts all possess the properties which Craig says are necessary. So they are immaterial, they are timeless, and so on, but they do not in any other way resemble Craig's Christian God. So why would we prefer the Christian God explanation over, say, the Tao explanation? But secondly, he says, quite correctly, that abstract objects do not really stand in the causal order of things. They can't really affect anything else. But my question would be, can disembodied minds? So Craig's view depends on this kind of dualism where there is almost like a substance that we might call mind that somehow spookily inhabits our bodies and which can alter brain processes, which can make our muscles move, and so on. But firstly, that would be a perspective as much in need of justification as the existence of God. So if your argument depends on dualism, then first you're going to need to prove that dualism is true. And if anything, that's an even more difficult ask, I think, than proving the existence of God. But even if we do accept something like a dualistic picture of the universe where mind is said to be something immaterial that can still somehow stand in the causal order of things, I'm not really sure if we've explained very much. So how actually is that possible? If mind is something immaterial, how is it producing material effects on the world? That's another thing demanding an explanation here. Have we ever seen a disembodied mind produce demonstrably any effects on the world? So Craig here can appeal to the creation of the universe as being dependent on a mind, but can he point to any other single phenomenon in the history of the universe that could only be explained through the activity of a disembodied mind? Do we have a single example of a disembodied mind affecting the causal order? So I know that in other places Craig has offered auxiliary justifications for this claim. So he did a debate, for example, with the physicist Sean Carroll in 2016, and I don't have audio of that debate, but I can quote from an answer he gave to an audience member who was inquiring about this very question, where he attempts to justify why it is that we have to invoke some kind of mind as the only possible transcendent cause of the universe. So he says, quote, "If the causal conditions that are present there are sufficient for the effect, then the effect would always have been there. But if they're not sufficient, then it becomes incomprehensible why the effect appeared just 13.7 billion years ago. And therefore, it seems to me, I argued, that this regime would itself have to have a beginning and come into existence. The contrast with this is when you have a libertarian agent with free will, he can exist from eternity, and then freely decide to produce an effect in time without any antecedent determining conditions. And so, in that sense, theism provides, I think, an explanatorily superior account of the origin of the universe because it's got the explanatory power that is vested in an agent with libertarian free will. End quote. Now, all Craig is really doing here is piling unjustified assumption on top of unjustified assumption. He's not really justifying any of these claims that he's making, and he's ending up with a sort of very convoluted theory that is based on premises, each of which are at the very least dubious and certainly questionable. So here, his reason for positing a personal agent as the cause of the universe depends on a libertarian conception of free will. That is a whole kettle of fish in its own right, and we're not going to get into a debate on free will here, but if his argument depends on the existence of libertarian free will, then it's at the very least questionable. A great many philosophers, probably the majority of philosophers, reject the notion of libertarian free will, but even if we spot him that, he's using, again, a fairly specific definition of libertarian free will, which depends on this idea that choices that a libertarian agent would make are somehow timeless, that these choices are not being caused by some antecedental factors. Again, that's a dubious assumption, so if we look at the way that human beings make decisions, for example, and we assume that human beings have libertarian free will, the kinds of choices that human beings are making are not just sort of spontaneously arising out of nothing, they are being informed by antecedental factors. We make choices based on our memories, we make choices based on previously learnt knowledge. We make choices in reliance of previous states of minds. Our decision-making process is most definitely sequential and temporal, so there is absolutely no reason that even someone who believes in libertarian free will has to accept this particular conception of libertarian free will as a kind of atemporal process. And then there's this assumption that the proximate cause of the universe must be a mind, because if that proximate cause is not a mind, then it's sort of like the cause and effect will always already have happened, because if this cause is atemporal, then there's no particular reason for that cause to have the effect of creating the universe at a particular time. I mean, says who? So Craig would still have the problem that if God is an atemporal being, as many classical theologians have asserted, then the concept of God has exactly the same problem. Why did he choose to create the universe at that particular moment in time as opposed to any other? It certainly doesn't strike me as completely intuitive that the Tao, for example, as a proximate cause of the universe, is going to fail because it's atemporal, whereas a different atemporal agent like God is going to succeed in this respect. And, I mean, when we're seeking an explanation for the creation of the universe, we're also seeking an explanation for the creation of time, so I don't think it makes any particular sense to suggest that the universe was created at some particular point in time, because time is one of the things we are trying to explain, so by definition, whatever caused the universe would have to be atemporal. It doesn't make sense to ask why that cause happened at a particular moment in time, because there wasn't time yet. That particular being was responsible for the creation of time. It's not like the Tao was just sitting there doing nothing for endless eons and then decided one day, oh, maybe I'll create the universe, because prior to the creation of the universe, there wasn't time. The Tao is timeless in the Taoist imagination. And again, there's no particular reason why we would have to invoke a supernatural concept like Tao. So there are phenomena in the universe, like photons, which don't really experience time. Time at the quantum level is a pretty sort of murky thing as well. So again, if we have an explanation for the cause of the universe that is non-agential in nature, I don't think that Craig's objections here really hold, because, again, we are talking about the creation of time. We're not talking about some kind of being, whether natural or supernatural, that was sitting there for a long time and then arbitrarily created the universe somehow. Rather, we're talking about the creation of time itself. It doesn't make sense to talk about the cause and effect always being there, because always is a temporal concept, which, as we've already established, should not be applied to whatever the cause of the universe is. But let's, for the sake of argument, put all of these, what I would say are fairly substantial qualms to one side. Let's extend a principle of charity, and we say, okay, we have good reason for believing that all of these things, the very many things that Craig is claiming here, are in fact true. Does that actually make this a good explanation? Has Craig, in these first two steps, really explained the existence of the universe? Well, of course, I would say no. So if we think back to those categories that I talked about in the previous episode about what makes a good explanation, basically none of them are on display here. So the first thing we said was that a good theory has to be testable. And the testable doesn't just mean that we can put the phenomenon under a microscope and observe if it really works, but we're invoking here a principle of generalizability, that if a particular theory or explanation is a good one, it's going to be in some way generalizable to a wide range of phenomena, and by applying this explanation to all these different phenomena, we should have a better idea about whether it holds. Well, the problem with these theistic explanations for the creation of the universe is they really only explain one thing. It explains, in a way, what happened at the creation of the universe, what caused the creation of the universe, but that's it. We can't generalize this principle and then test it, because really it's only invoked to explain a single event. None of the other things that Craig talks about here have any real explanatory power beyond the creation of the universe. We don't need this transcendent cause that Craig invokes to explain anything else that happens in nature. So it fails because it's not testable. We also said that two features of a good theory would be compatibility with background knowledge and ontological economy. So again, the problem here is that this transcendent cause, which exists as a kind of disembodied mind, is not compatible with other things that we know about the universe. There is nothing else we know to exist that in any way resembles the transcendent cause that Craig is positing here. And it's not very ontologically parsimonious because, of course, in addition to the existence of all of these natural forces and particles and so on, we're not just invoking a truly powerful deity, we're also introducing concepts like libertarian free will, like necessity, like contingency, like transcendence, like metaphysical dualism. So all of these make the universe a much more complicated place. The only way that this theory can work is if we posit this very exotic realm of very strange beings with very strange properties that enact very strange processes. And again, unless we have a very strong reason to do that, then a good explanation is typically going to rely only on those kinds of beings, those kinds of processes with which we are already familiar. Then we mentioned that the hallmark of a good explanation is one that is simple in the sense of minimizing auxiliary explanations that are required to make the original explanation work. And here again, I think Craig fails. So on the face of it, his argument might appear to be quite simple. So he uses these basic syllogisms like 1. The universe began to exist. 2. If the universe began to exist, then the universe has a transcendent cause. 3. Therefore, the universe has a transcendent cause. So this seems, on the face of it, like a pretty simple explanation. But the only way that we can get it to work or to make sense is to pile on all of these auxiliary hypotheses. As we've already said, it depends on things like metaphysical dualism being true. It depends on something like libertarian free will being true. It depends on the assumption that a somehow immaterial being can affect physical processes. So the argument doesn't work if we don't assume all of these auxiliary explanations as well. And so what on the face of it seems like quite a simple argument is actually just assumption piled on top of assumption. There is nothing simple about it, and so again, it fails that particular test. But I think most importantly, this kind of explanation fails because it fails to be informative. So, as we said in the last episode, a hallmark of good explanation is its informativeness, and informativeness here means its ability to explain a wide range of phenomena, to allow us to make predictions about many different things, how it is that we can explain fringe cases and failures in the original explanation, and so on. And Craig's explanation does none of this. His explanation is too vague. It depends on, as I said, these scholastic categories like transcendence, causality, contingency, necessity, atemporality, things like this, which are very difficult to define or which could be defined in a number of different ways. So if all of these basic foundational concepts are unclear, then the explanation is by necessity going to be unclear as well. The explanation that Craig gives doesn't tell us anything about what God is like beyond this minimal definition of a personal agent with libertarian free will, so it doesn't permit us to make any predictions about anything that's going to happen next or what God is going to do in the world. It doesn't permit us to make any predictions about what future cosmological investigations are going to uncover about the nature of the universe, because the explanation is simply too vague to allow us to make any of these sorts of inferences. Whereas if you have a good naturalistic cosmological model of the origin of the universe, it is probably going to have all of these features, or at least if it's a good model, then it's going to do all of these things. It's going to allow us to make predictions about what we are likely to find in our future scientific investigation. So a good scientific theory will also have this virtue of being falsifiable, which theistic explanations certainly are not. If we have a good cosmological model for the origin of the universe, that's probably going to permit us to explain a number of other things that are happening in the universe. It's going to allow us to make predictions about the kind of conditions that are necessary for the creation of universes. And again, theism has nothing to say about this. It just says God created the universe because he wanted to. So again, theistic explanations, particularly Craig's explanation here, fails to be informative. It fails to give us all of this information that we might find desirable in a good explanation. So again, even if we assume that there is some merit to what Craig is arguing here, that we can, in some sense, believe that his explanation is true, that still doesn't make it a good explanation. Okay, and with that, we can move on to Craig's third argument for the existence of God, and that is that God is the best explanation of the applicability of mathematics to the physical world. So here is what he has to say about that.
Philosophers and scientists have puzzled over what physicist Eugene Wigner called the uncanny effectiveness of mathematics. How is it that a mathematical theorist like Peter Higgs can sit down at his desk and by poring over mathematical equations predict the existence of a fundamental particle which experimentalists 30 years later, after investing millions of dollars and thousands of man-hours, are finally able to detect? Mathematics is the language of nature. But how is this to be explained? If mathematical objects are abstract entities causally isolated from the universe, then the applicability of mathematics is, in the words of philosopher of mathematics Penelope Matty, a happy coincidence. On the other hand, if mathematical objects are just useful fictions, how is it that nature is written in the language of these fictions?
Now, I'll be honest from the outset and admit that there has to be something that I am missing here, because I know that this is a kind of popular argument, not just in this context relating to theism or naturalism, but you'll often hear scientists, physicists or chemists express wonder at how it is that the things that they are studying can be modeled in a mathematical way. Isn't it extraordinary that reality is amenable to this sort of rational insight, that it does appear to be rational in the sense of following particular mathematical laws? But I just don't understand it because it seems incredibly simple to me. So the explanation, as I see it, is that yes, mathematics accurately tracks reality. We can use mathematics to understand reality, but that's because that's exactly what mathematics was invented to do. Mathematics is a human invention that we have designed in order to help us understand structures in the world. Now, again, that just seems too simple and too obvious to me, so I must be missing something. So feel free in the comments to tell me exactly why I'm wrong about this, but I'll explain my position here, and yeah, as I said, feel free to tell me what it is that I am missing, why this simple explanation fails. So if we start with basic arithmetic, for example, so if I put 5 oranges on the table, add another 2 oranges, we have 7 oranges. Or if we do the same with apples, 5 apples, add another 2, you have 7 apples. So what we can do is abstract these examples and create a kind of pure arithmetic where we say that 5 plus 2 always equals 7. So you don't actually need any corresponding physical object in order for that axiom to be true. 5 plus 2 just generally equals 7. Now, the point is that the numbers that we have, like 5 and 2 and 7, have been invented in order to track particular relationships that happen in the world. So there is a certain kind of relationship that we can say obtains when there are 5 apples or 5 oranges on the table. The relationship in each case is the same. When we add 2 apples or 2 oranges, again, there is a particular kind of relationship that exists in the world, a particular kind of structure, and we are tracking that structure by using these concepts like 5 and 2 and 7. So there's no big mystery here. It's not like, if we put 5 apples and 2 apples together, maybe it will equal 6, maybe it will equal 8, but the laws of the cosmos are saying, no, 5 plus 2 always has to equal 7. Don't you think about exemplifying the number 6 or number 8 instead? No, it's just because we live in a reality that has certain predictable structures, and numbers like 5, 2, and 7 track those particular structures. Or if we look at something a little bit more advanced and we study the rules of geometry, so if we take an obvious example like the Pythagorean theorem, which states that the square of the length of the hypotenuse in a right triangle is equal to the sum of the squares of the lengths of the other two sides. That's obviously something I just have memorized in my head. I didn't have to read that anywhere. But this is a universal truth of right triangles. So all right triangles have that particular law. They also have other laws going for them. So right triangles, like other triangles, always have internal angles of 180 degrees. All right triangles are also trilateral shapes. So all of these facts go together, but again, it's not like triangles are following this law. It's not like the triangle is striving with every ounce of its being to have internal angles which add up to 179 or 181 degrees, but the laws of mathematics are just stepping in and saying, nope, you've got to be 180 degrees. Rather, the things that we have invented here, so the notion of degrees and angles, and the particular mathematical relationship between the hypotenuse of the triangle and the other sides, all of these have been designed to track particular structures, particular stable, predictable structures that exist in the world. And the reason that the theorem of Pythagoras works is not because of some mystical connection between rationality and the universe. It's simply that triangles evince a particular kind of structure, and that structure is always going to be amenable to predictable mathematical principles. And so my claim here is pretty simple, and that is that anything that exists is going to have a kind of structure. It's going to stand in a particular kind of relationship to other things that exist. And every kind of physical structure, every kind of physical relationship is, at least in principle, going to be amenable to mathematical description, because that is what mathematics was invented to do. It was invented as a way to describe the physical structures of reality. And of course, there are some phenomena in the world that are going to be more difficult to describe mathematically than others. So obviously, the geometry of a 312-sided shape is going to be a lot more complicated than the mathematical description of a 3-sided shape, but it doesn't mean that that description is unavailable. If someone really wanted to sit down and to understand the structure of 312-sided shapes, they would be able to come up with a set of mathematical principles which describe what it means for a shape to have 312 sides. Now, we could, of course, imagine a reality in which there were no possible mathematical descriptions for anything that existed. But all I would say is that that kind of reality would be one without structure. It would be an absolute mess, total chaos, absolute entropy. So we can certainly imagine that when the heat death of the universe arrives, all structures in the universe have broken down, there is nothing left but diffuse radiation. This is not going to be amenable to mathematical description. Our mathematics will be useless in understanding that world, but that's because structures in that world don't exist. But any reality which is stable enough for structures to exist, and that's certainly going to include any reality in which living beings exist, is going to be amenable to mathematical description. And so I don't think there is anything mysterious to be explained here. But, of course, this isn't necessarily always going to work. So there are going to be some kinds of structures in existence which are simply too complex to be amenable to mathematical description. There's, again, I don't think anything mysterious about this. So when it came to understanding the orbital mechanics of the planets, for example, people like Newton and Leibniz realized pretty quickly that the mathematics that they had at their disposal was insufficient for understanding this phenomenon. So they literally had to invent an entire new branch of mathematics, that is, calculus, in order to explain the movement of the planets around the sun, because calculus deals with things like differentiation and change and so on that other forms of mathematics are not equipped to deal with. So here again is a pretty clear example of mathematics being a human invention in order to provide descriptions of the world which permit us to understand the world in deeper and more predictable ways. But what's interesting to me is how rapidly the complexity of the mathematics accelerates as we add more and more bodies to the equation. So it's very, very simple for cosmologists to model the movement of a single planet around the sun. When it comes to modeling two planets going around the sun, this is already something that is much, much more complicated, but I believe it's been more or less solved. But when we get to greater and greater numbers of planets in orbit around the sun, it's simply impossible to provide an accurate mathematical model of the structure of this system, of how these planets are actually behaving. And this is a well-known problem in physics referred to as the n-body problem. So here I would still suggest that the entire solar system is, in principle, capable of being described mathematically, but because the solar system is such a complex structure, the mathematics available to describe it is going to have to be incredibly complicated as well. So it's the same reason that the geometric principles underlying 312-sided shapes are going to be much more complicated than the geometric principles underlying 3-sided shapes. In the same way, any mathematical model that we can make of reality is going to be a reflection of the complexity of the structures that actually exist there in reality. So if the structure itself is very complicated, then either it's not going to be amenable to mathematical description, or at least it's going to require a kind of mathematics that is so complicated and convoluted that it's going to be basically useless in practice. And I think a good analogy for all this is the relationship that exists between a map and the territory that it represents. So when we create a map is going to be a simplified version of a certain territory, and it's going to be simplified because it really helps us to navigate the territory when the territory is presented in this kind of simplified form. But if we attempted to create a map in which every single pebble, every single blade of grass was present on the map, then the map basically ceases to function as a map. You know, it's not going to inform us about anything. It's going to be too complex and convoluted to use in practice, even though in principle you could create such a map. It's just like, why would you go to all that effort? But what is happening here really is that people are mistaking the map for the territory. It's like they're taking a map and saying, wow, isn't it incredible that all of our maps just happen to so neatly track the nature of the territory? How is it possible that all of these territories are so amenable to cartographical description? Well, there's nothing to be amazed at here, of course, because that's exactly what a map is designed to do. It's designed to be a kind of simplification, a kind of abstraction of reality that human beings can use in order to better navigate their way around the world. And mathematics, I'm arguing here, is basically the same thing. We have various structures in the world of varying complexity. Some of these structures are unique, some of them are repeated, but the point is that as soon as you have a particular kind of structure that stands in particular kinds of relationships to other things that exist. All of these structures, all of these relationships are going to, at least in principle, be amenable to mathematical description, because that is what mathematics does. It simplifies, it abstracts certain features of the world in order to make them more comprehensible to human beings. It serves the same function with respect to the universe that maps do with respect to territory. And again, if we're not going to be amazed by the fact that our maps happen to match up so neatly with the territories they describe, I don't think that we should necessarily be so astonished that the mathematics we create to describe reality just happens to match up neatly with reality. If the mathematics fail to do so, we wouldn't use that mathematics. We would develop a different method instead. And history has been littered, of course, with failed mathematical theories, theories which fail to comport with reality. So, again, like I said, I must have missed something here. It seems far too simple to me to explain this problem away in these terms, so please let me know what I've got wrong. But to me, this argument fails because, frankly, there's nothing here really to be amazed at. Okay, so the fourth argument that Craig uses for the existence of God is that God is the best explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. So this is a topic that we can breeze through relatively quickly because I've already done an entire episode devoted to this question of fine-tuning. So if you're interested in my thoughts on this topic in depth, I recommend you check out that episode when you get the chance. But to quickly recap, my main argument from that episode is that fine-tuning fails because all fine-tuning theorists tend to do is to observe that certain values of the universe are incredibly unlikely on naturalistic assumptions, which we can grant, but even then, there'd be caveats. It's not entirely clear to me what it would mean to say that certain values of the universe are unlikely on naturalistic assumptions, given that there is only one reality that we are familiar with, given that we don't know whether there is a single universe or a multiverse, and so on. But even ignoring all those concerns, even if we really can agree with the fine-tuning theorist that these values are incredibly unlikely on naturalistic assumptions, the fine-tuning theorist can't simply say that. The fine-tuning theorist also has to explain in detail how it is we can know that these values would be more likely on theistic assumptions. So that is, you can't simply say these values are unlikely on naturalistic assumptions. You also have to show that they are demonstrably more likely on theistic assumptions. And this is going to be very difficult to do. Firstly, because we are talking about a being, God, who has infinite power at his disposal, so he could create literally any kind of universe that you could possibly conceive of. And given that infinite range of universes available to him, what really are the odds of him producing this particular one? So there are any number of billions of potential universes that could house life, so why choose this universe in particular? What are the odds of God producing this particular universe? Well, I would argue it's basically impossible to say, and if we cannot say, then fine-tuning doesn't really have a case. It cannot say that the values of the universe are more likely on theistic assumptions because it cannot tell us what the odds of these values truly are on theistic assumptions. And a second issue that I raised with fine-tuning in that episode is that really a lot of the assumptions about fine-tuning, that the universe is really finely tuned for life, I don't think really stand up to scrutiny. So basically, the universe as we know it is just barely good enough to produce life under very specific conditions in very specific parts of the universe. 99.99999% of space and the same percentage of time is going to be completely hostile to life. So for most of the history of the universe, life is basically going to be impossible, because as the structures of the universe break down, as stars begin to die, we enter into a very long period where there's nothing but black holes and radiation, and life cannot exist. That phase of the universe is going to be 99.9999% of the history of the universe. So given all this cold, black expanse, both, in terms of the universe at its current time and the future history of the universe, can we really say that this universe is fine-tuned for life? It seems like if God's intention was to create life, certainly to create conscious life, this is a pretty strange universe for him to create, because the universe can only just create conscious life. Conscious life existing in this universe is an incredibly tenuous process, so one stray comet and, it's done for on this planet. So again, I don't think that the claims of fine-tuning theorists that this universe is just perfectly designed down to the very last detail, the very last value for the creation of human life, really holds much water, because frankly, the universe is not very good at doing the very thing that God apparently wants it to do. And these arguments aside, even if we believe that there is some truth to fine-tuning, that we have reasons to believe that the fine-tuning argument is really true, it still fails as an explanation for certain reasons that we discussed in the last episode. So this theory is, of course, not testable because, again, it's only describing a single event. We can't generalize this into making certain predictions or expectations about certain other phenomena in the universe. So there is a way you could make it testable. You could say, given that God's interest was the creation of human life, all values of the universe should be precisely fine-tuned for that. So there are certainly things that we are yet to discover in cosmology. So all fine-tuning needs to do is to say, okay, if we have a God who has fine-tuned the universe for the creation of life, say, then we should expect to find these particular values. So when we investigate the universe in a bit more depth, when we come up with a grand theory of everything, for example, it should include these particular features. Now, of course, no fine-tuning theorist is able to do that because fine-tuning is not a good explanation. It's not testable, it's not generalizable. Fine-tuning, yet again, falls afoul of this principle of ontological parsimony, which should be a part of every good theory. So it only works if we posit this exotic being of God. It's not simple because it requires a bunch of auxiliary hypotheses to explain, for example, why God decided to use physical principles in the creation of the universe at all. That is, why did he bother to create a material reality when he could have created conscious life in an immaterial context? In fact, he could have supported life in literally any kind of context, so it's within God's power to support a living being in a completely empty black void. So again, why go through this whole rigmarole of creating this huge expanse of material reality? It would also need auxiliary hypotheses to explain why he bothered to use evolution, which incorporates so much suffering, in order to create conscious life. It would need auxiliary hypotheses to explain why the universe is so big, why it's so empty, and so on. So fine-tuning is not actually going to be a simple explanation for the origins of the universe, presuming that it is able to explain each of these various things as well. And certainly fine-tuning is not a particularly informative theory either, because it can't explain why God chose exactly these values, because, slightly different values would also be compatible with life. So, for example, one of the fundamental physical values of the universe is that a proton is 1,836 times heavier than an electron, and it needs to be somewhere in this range in order for life to emerge. But why not 1,835? Why not 1,837? These would also produce universes that are conducive to life, so fine-tuning fails to explain why God chose exactly the values that he did when there are a limited range of possibilities that would also produce life. So, in fact, fine-tuning explains nothing. It does not explain why the universe has the values that it has, and that is what it sets out to explain. So, again, it fails as an explanation. So, the fifth argument that Craig raises here is that God is the best explanation of intentional states of consciousness in the world. So, here is how he explains that.
Philosophers are puzzled by states of intentionality. Intentionality is the property of being about something or of something. It signifies the object directedness of our thoughts. For example, I can think about my summer vacation, or I can think of my wife. No physical object has this sort of intentionality. A chair, or a stone, or a glob of tissue like the brain is not about or of something else. Only mental states or states of consciousness are about other things.
So, to me, this is probably the weakest and certainly the most mystifying of the explanations that Craig gives here. So, what he raises is actually a very interesting philosophical problem, so the nature of intentionality. So, this relates to the relationship between particular thoughts we have, or on the physicalist worldview, the relationship between particular brain states and objects in the world. So, the theory of intentionality from a phenomenological perspective. So, phenomenology is a philosophy that I have been very interested in for a long time. Again, it's one of those topics I would like to do an entire episode on. But from my readings in phenomenology, intentionality is a very important concept in understanding consciousness, but it's never mystified to this extent, although there are problems relating to how exactly it is that consciousness can be about something in the world. I've never seen any sort of argument which suggests that this is a major catastrophic problem that has to be solved, and if we can't come up with a philosophical answer for this problem, our only recourse is to imagine that there must be a god orchestrating everything. It's a little bit strange to me. So, my understanding of intentionality from a phenomenological perspective is basically that there is no such thing as pure consciousness, but if we are conscious, that always means to be conscious of something. So we can't just be conscious full stop, but I am conscious that I am talking. I am conscious that I am breathing. I am conscious that I am looking out the window. All of these things. So, in every single case, to be conscious means to be conscious of something else. And this observation can take us to some pretty interesting places. So, Sartre, for example, took this to mean that actually consciousness is nothingness, and that everything that we are is constituted by what we are not. So that's why you get these mystifying lines in Sartre like, I am what I am not, and I am not what I am. That only makes sense if you understand Sartre's understanding of consciousness as entirely composed, essentially, of intentional states. But Sartre is a bit of an extreme example. So if we take the case of Husserl, for example, and how it was that he explained intentionality, basically Husserl believed that when we engage in an act of perception, let's say, so perceiving that a tree exists, he referred to this as a noetic act, so the act of perceiving. And the thing that we actually perceive in this case, or the thing that our perception is about, is referred to as the noema. So here the noema would be the tree. But importantly for Husserl, there's no possibility of accessing the tree in itself. This is what Kant referred to as the noumenal world. So rather, when we say that consciousness is about a tree, this is what Husserl would call a noematic construction. So when we think about a tree, obviously this is informed in some way by what a tree actually is, but properly in conscious experience, we never actually have access to the tree itself, only our noematic construction of how the tree is actually perceived. Now, I forgive you right now if your eyes are glazing over and you're thinking, why on earth is he telling me all this? But the point of all this is just to show that there are philosophical theories of intentionality which recognize that there is a kind of inaccessibility of the actual world, so that when I say that my thoughts are about a tree, properly, Husserl would say, I'm not actually thinking about a tree, I'm thinking about a noematic tree, about a tree that has been constructed in my conscious experience through the noetic act of perception. So, to put it more simply, there is a kind of ontological gap between conscious experience and things themselves, and when we say that consciousness is about something, that it has these intentional states, we should be clear that my thinking about a tree, or my being conscious of a tree, doesn't refer to the tree itself, but rather a kind of mental construction that has been informed by my perceptions of the world. Now, the relevance of all this is that Craig says that things like rocks or globs of goo, or however he phrased it, can't really be about anything. And I think that the argument becomes a bit more clear when we recognize that he's also said, not here but in other places, that things like neural patterns, the firing of a particular neuron, these also cannot be about something. So consciousness can be about something, minds can be about something, but on a purely physicalist approach to the universe, things like rocks cannot be about anything. A glob of goo cannot be about anything. A particular brain state on a physicalist worldview cannot be about anything. Now, that's already a pretty dubious claim. Just because something is physical, it doesn't mean that it can't be about anything. And maybe the easiest way to show this is to talk about the notion of indexality in semiotics. So indexality is this idea that sometimes something means something by virtue of its relationship to something else, by virtue of its reliably being found in consonance with something else. So it would be perfectly cogent, for example, to say that smoke means fire. So here it's not like the fire is consciously producing smoke. It's not like it is attempting to communicate anything to human beings, but nonetheless, smoke still has that meaning. Smoke means fire. So depending on how we go about defining aboutness, what we see is that really smoke is about fire, in a sense. There is no consciousness involved, but at the same time, there are signs, there is meaning, there is aboutness here. And what we could say on a physicalist view of consciousness is that neural structures or particular brain patterns, particular physicalist patterns of thought, have a sort of indexical relationship to the actual physical world. So the relationship between particular neural patterns in the brain and actual physical objects is not at all arbitrary. Rather, there is a particular semiotic relationship there. There is a kind of aboutness in the same way that smoke can be said to be about fire. So too can we say that physicalist conceptions of the brain, physicalist treatments of thoughts and ideas can also be about particular objects. So the easiest way to explain this kind of relationship is to take a kind of etiological view of the origin of intentional states, and therefore to show that there is a particular causal relationship between the world and our thoughts about the world, in the same way that there is a sort of necessary causal relationship between smoke and fire. So if we take something like color, for example, so what plainly happens is we go out into the world, we open our eyes, there is something there in the world that is blue, this triggers a certain process in our eyes, this sends particular signals to the brain creates a particular kind of structure which represents a memory of that color, and thereby we can say that we have perceived color. So here, the relationship between our conscious experience of color and the actual color itself is not arbitrary. There is a pretty clear causal relationship at work here. And so when later we think about the color blue, what we're simply doing is basically repeating this process in reverse. So when we think about the color blue, our brain is being stimulated, certain patterns in the brain are being stimulated. This simulates vision in some way. So when we think about the color blue, the same parts of our brain and our ocular system that are involved in color vision are being stimulated in the same way. And so this is how we think about the color blue. So that secondary thought about the color blue still has a direct causal relationship to the actual color blue that we have seen in the world. And so therefore, while strictly speaking, the color blue that we experience in memory is a noematic construction, the thing is that our original experience of the color blue is also a noematic construction, so we're never going to get at what the color blue is actually like in a noumenal sense. What is blue like independently of conscious experience and conscious structures? We will never know. But the point is that the intentionality on display here, when I think about the color blue, I am really thinking about the color blue because there is a direct causal relationship between the color blue and my conscious experience of it, my thinking about it. Now, if none of that makes sense to you, or if none of that is convincing to you, it doesn't really matter, because the main problem here is that even if we don't have a convincing physicalist explanation of intentionality, merely invoking God does not solve the problem either. So if particular patterns in a physical brain can't really be about anything, then in what sense can the kinds of processes that go on in an immaterial mind be said to be about anything? So what exactly is the picture of intentionality on theistic assumptions? How is it exactly that God can make an immaterial mind be about a physical object? And more importantly, this sort of explanation that God somehow solves the problem of intentionality also falls foul of that virtue of informativeness that we talked about in the last episode. So if we simply say that intentionality is made possible by God, we still haven't really explained very much about intentionality, and importantly, we've really failed to explain sort of fringe cases or cases where the process fails. So how, for example, would this theistic account of intentionality account for hallucinations? So hallucinations still have an intentionality, they are about something, but in this case they are about something that doesn't really exist. So if I turn my head and I see a ghostly woman in the corner, then we can hopefully agree, and Dr. Craig will agree with me, that that ghostly woman is not really there. But at the same time, what has caused me to believe this? What, in this case, is my conscious state actually about? Or on a more prosaic level, if we think about fictional entities. So when I am thinking about Sherlock Holmes, this is, a kind of long-standing problem in philosophy. How do we deal with intentionality with respect to fictional objects? When I think about Sherlock Holmes, what actually am I thinking about, given that there is no such thing as Sherlock Holmes in the world? And again, the theistic explanation does not account for this. Is God simply implanting in my mind false impressions of Sherlock Holmes and ghosts? Is that what God is really about? Well, you need to come up with some kind of explanation. If this is going to be an informative explanation, which, as we've said, is a hallmark of a good explanation, then you also need to be able to explain these fringe cases. And I'd be particularly interested to know how a theist would explain particular cases where intentional states are absent altogether. So if, for example, a blind person tries to think about the color blue, they are simply incapable of representing that particular thing. They simply do not have the requisite experiences in order to think about the color blue. Now, on a physicalist explanation, this is a relatively trivial thing to explain. So the reason that a blind person cannot see the color blue is because they have never stood in the appropriate causal relationship to the color blue. For whatever reason, that causal sequence from the color blue to the perception of the color blue to the imprinting of the color blue in the mind somehow has been severed. So a blind person will never be able to think about the color blue because they don't have an indexical relationship to the color blue, or their brain does not have that indexical causal relationship. But on theistic explanations, if conscious states can be about things even independently of this physical causality, then why is it that blind people aren't able to think about colors? Why aren't they able to have any sort of visual experiences at all? You would think that if God exists and if God is somehow responsible for intentional states, he might occasionally grant blind people these kinds of experiences. There is nothing preventing God from allowing blind people to think about the color blue, but obviously they can't do that. So there's a physicalist explanation for that, but how does a theist account for the fact that some people are able to have certain intentional states about certain things in the world, whereas other people lack those intentional states in their entirety? So again, there's this issue where even if we lend some credence to the idea that God is somehow responsible for the generation of intentional states in human minds, and again, I'm very much left in the dark as to how that is supposed to work in practice, this is still a bad explanation because it doesn't really explain anything. Okay, and so now we come to the sixth argument that Craig gives for the existence of God, and that is that God is the best explanation of objective moral values and duties in the world. So here is how he explains that.
In moral experience, we apprehend moral values and duties which impose themselves as objectively binding and true. For example, we all recognize that it's wrong to walk into an elementary school with an automatic weapon and to shoot little boys and girls and their teachers. On a naturalistic view, however, there's nothing really wrong with this. Moral values are just the subjective byproducts of biological evolution and social conditioning. Dr. Rosenberg is brutally honest about the implications of his atheism. He writes, "There is no such thing as morally right or wrong. Individual human life is meaningless and without ultimate moral value. We need to face the fact that nihilism is true." By contrast, the theist grounds objective moral values in God and our moral duties in his commands. The theist thus has the explanatory resources which the atheist lacks to ground objective moral values and duties.
So, in some ways, this is the easiest of all these arguments to respond to, because really all an atheist needs to do in response to this kind of argument is to say, yes, I agree with you. An atheist can very cogently say it's impossible to have objective moral values without God there to ground them, in which case, well, so much for objective moral values. So Craig here, of course, is going to argue that objective morals obviously exist. We'll come to that in a moment. But the argument that God is necessary for grounding objective moral values, even if that is true, is not really a cogent argument for God in itself. Maybe there is no God, in which case there are no objective moral values. There's nothing incoherent about that position. Now, as for this question as to whether objective moral values really do exist, I've done an entire episode on a related topic, that is the topic of moral realism. So being committed to a moral realist position and being committed to a position of moral objectivity are not necessarily exactly the same thing. So my argument in that episode was against moral realism, and here particularly I'm arguing against the existence of an independent realm of mind-independent moral facts. I certainly don't think that is a live possibility, whether on theistic or naturalistic assumptions, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to throw moral objectivity into the bin. So there are other situations where you can have certain facts that are objectively true, even though they are purely human constructions. So if, as I argue, morality really is nothing but a human construction, it makes no sense to talk about morality independently of human minds and human lives. But that is not to say that moral values, simply because they are a human creation, lack all objectivity. So in that episode, for example, I mentioned that moral facts, should we suppose them to exist, would track pretty closely with certain materialistic facts. In fact, they would be, I would argue, supervenient upon non-moral facts. So the example that I used there was if you can imagine two different worlds, but exactly the same action is performed in each world. If that action is immoral in the first world, it's also by necessity going to be immoral in the second world. So moral facts, moral values do have this supervenience upon non-moral facts. They should be invariantly correlated with particular non-moral facts. So that's one path to moral objectivity. The other thing I'll say here is that there are non-moral human-created facts that we would ordinarily judge as potentially objective. So if I say, for example, that France is a wealthier country than Turkmenistan, every part of that sentence is a human creation. These concepts like France, Turkmenistan, wealth, and country, they have no independence beyond human minds. They do not exist beyond a human context. But at the same time, I think we can all agree that it is objectively true that France is a wealthier country than Turkmenistan. And that's because, there are certain material facts about the nature of France, the kind of resources it has there, that words like France and wealth are reliably tracking. And so even though, as I said, every aspect of that sentence is a human creation, it is still objectively true. It is still a reflection of the true state of the world to say that France is a wealthier country than Turkmenistan. Now, in the case of morality, so Craig uses this example of someone going into a school and murdering a lot of children. he says that we know that this is objectively morally wrong, and frankly, I would agree with him. So, even though morality is a human creation, if the word is going to have any sort of meaning, if it's going to track any particular facts in the world, then certainly the murder of children is going to be immoral. Everybody can agree on that, in the same way that they can agree that France is a wealthier country than Turkmenistan. And, of course, there might be people who disagree, there might be people who think it's a good idea to go into a school and to kill children, just as there might be some strange people who believe that Turkmenistan is actually a richer country than France. But again, these claims are not tracking particular material facts. If a word like wealth has any particular meaning, then it can only possibly be the case that France is a wealthier country than Turkmenistan. And so if the word immoral has any particular meaning, then it can only be the case that murdering innocent children is immoral. If that particular act is not immoral, then the word ceases to have any particular meaning at all. Now, of course, Craig here would like to say, okay, so you've agreed that murdering children is objectively morally wrong, and I believe that the only way that you can arrive at objective moral values is through God. Therefore, your admission of these objective moral facts points in the direction of a God as the necessary grounding of the objective moral wrong of this act. Now, I would say here, hold your horses. So, as I've already said, I've already given a pretty good reason why something could be objective, even if it's a purely human creation, even if it finds no justification beyond human minds. So, in this case, we have a sort of shared set of human values. We have a shared vocabulary, including these words moral and immoral. We ideally want these particular words to map correctly onto those particular values. And so if we start to say, well, hang on, maybe murdering innocent children is not quite so morally wrong as all that, well, the word, as I've said, ceases to have any meaning. The objectivity, in this case, comes from a kind of intersubjective consensus about what it is that we value and the kind of words that we use to describe things that plainly run against those values. And the important point is that on this view of morality, there's nothing really left for God to do. So God can look at this intersubjective consensus that human beings have reached about the immorality of killing children, and he can put his hand up and say, hey, yeah, I agree with that. I also think it's immoral. But that's completely irrelevant. It would be immoral with or without God's sanctioning of this particular event. And it's the same with the wealth of France. If God puts his hand up and says, yeah, I agree with you guys, France is objectively a wealthier country than Turkmenistan, it wouldn't make any difference to the material facts. France is wealthy, independently of God's opinion on that subject, just as murdering innocent children is morally wrong, independently of God's opinion on that matter. Now, even if you disagree with my reasoning here, it's not really that relevant to the rest of my argument here. As I've said, I am something of a moral anti-realist, but just to be clear here, there is a difference between saying that moral facts are a construction of the human mind, there are no mind-independent moral facts, is not the same thing as saying that there is not an objective component to morality. As long as we recognize that really the highest standard of truth we can aspire to is a kind of intersubjective univocity, then I think that morality can be as objective as any other fact in the human world. But as I said, all of this is not really so central to my main argument, which is that even if it is true that on a naturalistic view of the world we can't really ground morality in anything objective, The problem is that even on theistic assumptions, I still think that's pretty darn difficult to do. Now, this is a huge topic. This is a topic that I want to spend a whole episode on as part of my Why God Doesn't Matter series, because I think that this is a pretty central claim that a lot of theists make, that we need God in some way for objective morality. I don't think that's the case, and I'm going to spell it out in much more detail in that episode, but I'll give you a couple of quick reasons why, and then hopefully by the time that episode comes out, I'll be able to spell this out a little bit further. So, the first point I'd make here is that spelling out a particular moral ontology is absolutely useless, even if it's true, even if it's based in fact, if we don't have a corresponding moral epistemology to go with it. So, simply saying that there are objective moral facts in the universe which stem from God doesn't really help us very much if we don't have reliable access into what those moral facts are. So here, Craig uses a very uncontroversial opinion that shooting young children is probably not a moral thing to do. I'll notice here that he didn't use the example of abortion or euthanasia or capital punishment or gay marriage or any of these issues which spark genuine moral division. So, on Craig's view of the world, there are going to be objective facts about whether these are moral or immoral, and I think I can probably predict which side he's going to fall on with each of these issues. But the point is, whichever side he takes, whichever side he believes to be objectively moral or immoral, he is going to have a lot of Christians, not to say people from other backgrounds as well, but simply Christians who are going to disagree with him. Now, every Christian is coming at the issue with the same attitude. They have the belief that morality is grounded in God, and that God's morality is revealed in a number of ways, so through the Bible, through the exercise of conscience, through direct revelation. There's a number of ways that God might make his moral commands to be known, but the point is that every Christian on the planet is operating from a very similar assumption about the ontology of morality, so what morality actually is, and yet they still differ widely amongst themselves about what concretely is moral and what concretely is immoral. And this is pretty difficult to explain, I think, on a theistic worldview. So, what is this objective morality actually doing in the world? What are God's commands actually doing in the world? So, the first problem you have is that even if you want to argue that there is an objective morality, that gets us literally nowhere if you can't spell it out for us in every possible situation what is objectively right and what is objectively wrong. Well, not even in every possible situation, but simply where there are areas of moral disagreement, you have to be able to provide a reliable way of adjudicating between conflicting moral claims. Because it certainly seems to be the case that in other areas where we are inclined to believe that objective facts exist, we can also come up with certain criteria which help us to decide which things are objectively true and which objectively are not. But there is not such a test for morality. There is no reliable way at getting at what this objective morality actually entails. Now, I've seen Craig address this point on various occasions before, and here he will insist that actually we should keep these problems of moral ontology and moral epistemology separate. So I don't think that's a particularly valid move. I don't see the value in invoking objective morality, as I said, if we don't know what that objective morality entails. But I think then a much more fatal argument to Craig's position is that venerable old argument, nearly 2,500 years old now, that we commonly refer to as the Euthyphro dilemma. So the Euthyphro dilemma, as many of you will already know, was a dilemma posed by Socrates but written about by Plato, which runs something like, is something beloved by the gods because it is holy, or is it holy because it is beloved by the gods? So in this particular context, we can change it a little bit and say, is something immoral because it is disliked by God, or does God dislike it because it's immoral? And this argument gets right to the heart of the foundations of morality and what it is that we can really say is grounding morality. So here you can choose either horn of the dilemma. So if you say that God dislikes something because it's immoral, then the problem obviously is you are positing a kind of independent standard of goodness. So all God is really doing here is acting as a kind of cosmic bureaucrat whose main duty is simply to rubber stamp particular acts that would already be moral or immoral without his approval or disapproval. So God, from this perspective, would not actually be creating or founding or certainly not grounding objective moral values. He would simply be the most perfect exemplification of them, or the being in the universe in the position to give the best advice on what is or is not moral. But on this horn of the dilemma, he is certainly not grounding morality. But on the other hand, if we choose the other horn and we say something is immoral because God dislikes it, now we have the problem that moral values are somehow arbitrary, and as Joe Schmidt, who hosts the Majesty of Reason podcast, says time and time again, it also creates a kind of moral subjectivity or moral relativism, because it means that all moral values in the universe are the creation of a particular subject, that they are defined relative to a particular subject. So if God ever changed his mind on any particular moral issue, which, he is quite able to do because he is the ultimate arbiter of what is or is not moral, so by definition whatever he says goes, then there is something frighteningly arbitrary about moral values. And certainly this would not lead us to objective moral values either, because as we've said, they are the product of a subjective being. They are the subjective opinion, the subjective valuation of a particular agent. Now, we're not going to get into all the possible objections that a theist might make to this line of argument. As I've said, we'll tackle that in the episode that will be devoted to this topic. But very quickly, one common defense of moral objectivity in the face of the Euthyphro challenge is to say, well, this is an invalid formulation because God is goodness. God is simply the definition of goodness. But the problem is, for basically any defense that a theist can come up with for the Euthyphro dilemma, it almost always is going to generate a kind of second-order Euthyphro problem. So if you imagine that we can hand-wave this problem away by simply saying, well, God and goodness are conspecific, we can still very legitimately ask the question, okay, well, what exactly is it that makes God good? Is God good because he exemplifies certain objective moral properties, or is he good because he is just defined as the yardstick of what is good? So whatever God's nature just happens to be, that is what we are going to define as good. So again, you have this problem where on this second order Euthyphro dilemma, there's still this issue. Is morality something that we can refer to objectively, independently of God, or is it the arbitrary creation of God? And either way, it seems a little bit strange to say that God is grounding morality in either of these cases, because it seems like no matter what we try to do to avoid this problem, we either have objective moral facts independently of God, and again, there's a number of different ways that this can be expressed. We will talk about this, as I've said, in the future episode. Or we run into the problem that moral duties are kind of arbitrary, they are dependent on God's whim, we do not have any control over what God's whim is going to be day to day, so all of the moral values that we hold so dear are always subject to revision and entirely dependent on the whim of an utterly sovereign being over whom we can exert no control and whom, frankly, we can't really understand. So the Euthyphro dilemma can be expressed, as I've said, in a number of different ways. I think this is basically fatal to the issue of God grounding objective morality. But again, even if you don't accept any of these arguments, there is still the problem that what Craig is offering here is still not a good explanation of morality. Simply saying that God grounds objective morality doesn't teach us anything, it doesn't explain anything. So firstly, yet again, it's not testable, it's not generalizable in any sense. I mean, you could alter the theory and suggest something like those places in the world which are Christian and which are most receptive to God are going to embody higher moral standards than those parts of the world that are not Christian. Well, good luck making that argument, but at least it would be testable. But simply saying that God grounds objective morality, but, of course, some people get it right, some people get it wrong, that's not a testable claim, that's not an interesting claim. We also have the problem, yet again, of ontological parsimony, so it's not just the mere fact that we have to invoke God here, but we have to invoke these sort of weird, spooky moral properties. So this is something, again, I talked about in my episode on moral realism. This is an argument which comes from J.L. Mackie, which is to say that if there are objective moral properties in the world, these are going to be kind of spooky, immaterial properties that, again, don't really correlate to any specific material facts about the world, so they're going to have to somehow circulate independently of the rest of empirical reality. And of course, this invites the question, well, how then can we know about these moral properties? What sensory apparatus do we possess to identify these moral properties in the world? And apart from the metaphysical issues that this presents, it's also something that, pushes morality out of human hands, and I find something a little bit distasteful about that. So this might be the inner atheist in me talking, but I think that it is very important that human beings, to some extent, be the masters of their own values, the masters of their own destiny, and if morality is something that is circulating completely independently of human minds, that human minds have no influence in shaping, then I think that's a very alienating kind of morality, and that's not an argument against these objective moral values, but I will just put it on record to say that I find something a little bit distasteful about this kind of attitude towards morality. But another problem with this argument is that it simply fails to be informative in any way, so it doesn't really teach us anything about morality in the real world. So, for example, it fails to explain, as we've already said, moral disagreement, not just between different cultures, but between people of the same culture. So if you have two Christians who are in complete agreement about the source of morality, what is it exactly that explains their moral disagreement in this case? Do we just say one of them is wrong? But again, what does that actually explain? It would be much more useful to know why someone is wrong than to simply say, if there is a moral disagreement, there is an objective fact of the matter about who is right, but we don't know who that is. I mean, where does that really get us? And at the end of the day, it's not going to be a terribly simple theory either, so it's going to violate that particular virtue of a good explanation as well, because the only real way to make it work is to pile auxiliary hypothesis on top of auxiliary hypothesis. So you might say, well, moral disagreement is a consequence of sin, clouding our judgment. the argument is already much more complex than it was originally. You're going to need to come up with a number of auxiliary explanations for why different holy scriptures say different things about what is or is not moral. You're going to have to come up with auxiliary explanations. As I've said, for moral disagreement, you're going to have to come up with explanations for moral progress, and merely positing the fact that God is the ground of morality is not going to answer any of these questions. And these are the important questions, I would say. So no one is living in any doubt about the fact that murdering a room full of school children is the wrong thing to do, so introducing God as the moral grounding of that fact doesn't really teach us anything, but what we really need is a way of deciding these very thorny moral issues. And of course, as usual, when there is some difficulty in the world, when we are most in need of Him, that is also when God is most silent. So, for all of these reasons, even if you want to say it is true that we need God to ground objective morality, it still fails as an explanation. We are still in exactly the same place, living with the same degree of ambiguity and uncertainty that we were before. Okay, so argument number 7 for the existence of God. God is the best explanation of the historical facts about Jesus of Nazareth. So, as you can probably tell, this is where the arguments transition from, fairly sound, grounded philosophical arguments into what basically amounts to Christian apologetics. But here is what Craig has to say about this.
Now, I realize that most people probably think that the resurrection of Jesus is something you just accept by faith or not. But there are actually 3 facts recognized by the majority of historians today, which I believe are best explained by the resurrection of Jesus. Fact number 1, on the Sunday after his crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers. 2, on separate occasions, different individuals and groups of people saw appearances of Jesus alive after his death. And 3, the original disciples suddenly came to believe in the resurrection of Jesus, despite having every predisposition to the contrary.
So these are all pretty common apologetic arguments that you might have heard from a number of different places, and certainly it's very important, I think, for Christians to believe that the mythology at the core of their faith really does have a kind of historical basis, because, really it's true that if Jesus was not really historically resurrected, then it's a little bit unclear what Christianity could possibly mean. So it is very important for Christians to make this defense that really the resurrection of Jesus is based in history, and we have strong historical reasons for believing in its truth. Now, predictably enough, I do not agree with that, so let's quickly run through each of these 3 facts, and I'll explain why they don't really hold up. So the first one, on the Sunday after his crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers. So this contains a couple of common tropes in Christian apologetics, and that is pointing to the tradition of the empty tomb, and pointing to this tradition that the first witnesses of the resurrection were women. So with respect to the empty tomb, so there is no doubt, as most Christian apologists will be happy to tell you, that this is almost certainly an early tradition. We find this, I think, in all 4 of the Gospels, at the very least, so it's clearly an idea that was circulating. It certainly does fit in with the kind of expectations that the Jewish groups who originally followed Jesus would have had about the nature of the resurrection. So importantly, they believed in a bodily resurrection. So this is, exactly the kind of fact that would be claimed on that particular worldview. But even though it is clearly an early tradition, we should be clear that it is not universal. So, for example, the empty tomb tradition is not mentioned at all by Paul. And when it comes to Paul, we have to be a little bit careful with how we treat his silence on different issues. So, Paul was not really a systematic theologian. It's only really the book of Romans which attempts a systematic theology. He was rather what we call an occasional writer, so he was writing predominantly to churches that he had founded, responding to particular problems that they were facing there in a kind of ad hoc occasionalist way. And so just because Paul doesn't write about something, it doesn't necessarily mean that he didn't believe it or wasn't familiar with it. It just meant he didn't really have the opportunity to talk about this particular thing. But Paul's silence on the empty tomb tradition is, I think, a little bit more difficult to explain. Firstly, Paul is writing frequently about the resurrection of Jesus, so it certainly seems apparent to me that in his writings he was far more interested in Jesus as a resurrected figure than he was about Jesus as a sort of earthly teacher. He basically never cites any of Jesus' earthly teachings or his deeds in his letters, but he is constantly going on about the resurrection. So why doesn't he take the time, at least once, to mention this empty tomb tradition? And I think this is particularly striking in the book of 1 Corinthians, in chapter 15, where he's trying to explain to the Corinthians the nature of the resurrection. And he goes through this very abstruse theologizing, which involves a sort of conceptual distinction between the nature of flesh, the nature of spirit, and the nature of the body in order to explain what the resurrection entails. But if you just want to give the Corinthians a very simple example of what the resurrection involves, there cannot be a better story than the empty tomb, because that demonstrates the bodily nature of the resurrection, the idea that upon the moment of the resurrection, the body is revivified, it might be taken away somewhere. The empty tomb illustrates this perfectly, and it also invites the question, why were the Corinthians apparently so confused about this doctrine if they had been familiar with the empty tomb tradition and other resurrection appearance traditions? But, that's maybe a topic for another day. But even if we ignore this, even if we accept the fact that the empty tomb was a very early tradition in Christianity, and therefore to that extent is more likely to contain a kernel of historical truth, that still hardly really makes the case for a historical resurrection. So let's presume that there really was an empty tomb. So you'll often hear Christian apologists posing alternative explanations for the empty tomb. So something like, maybe Jesus' body was stolen by his followers, and they'll immediately dismiss these explanations as nonsense. Now, I agree. On the face of it, it doesn't seem very likely that his followers would steal his body and sort of fake a resurrection appearance. But when you're comparing that to the plausibility of a man being raised from the dead, it really isn't that outlandish an explanation. And particularly, there are other circumstantial facts in the Gospel of Mark in particular, where it's made apparent that Jesus' body is given to Joseph of Arimathea to take care of for burial, and it explicitly takes the time to mention that Joseph of Arimathea was a believer in the coming kingdom of God. Well, what better way to demonstrate the coming kingdom of God, what better way to attract people to your cause than by faking the resurrection of the Messiah? Now, I'm not saying that this is what happened, but I'm saying that it's at least as plausible as the idea that a man who had been dead for 3 days was suddenly brought back to life. And even if you don't believe that that particular explanation has much going for it, there are still any number of prosaic explanations that would explain this historical data of an empty tomb. So what about this idea, for example, that people who really didn't like Jesus, they didn't like the idea that this criminal was getting a proper burial, came overnight to desecrate the tomb. They might have come to steal his body and burn his bones out in the wilderness as a means of desecrating the body. why wouldn't this be plausible? Again, I'm not suggesting this is what really happened, but it's surely just as plausible as the idea that someone was resurrected from the dead. Or what about this idea that he was just never really buried in the first place? So maybe it came to be that he was taken down from the cross, but he was never actually given to Joseph of Arimathea for burial. He was taken out with other common criminals, and his body was, left to rot in the wilderness. Well, it would have been pretty easy for Joseph of Arimathea, say, to suggest that he had actually buried the body, and then when the women came the next day to anoint the body, lo and behold, the body isn't there. Well, maybe it wasn't there in the first place. And again, I'm not suggesting this is what happened. That's, on the face of it, a ridiculous explanation. But can you really say that it's any more ridiculous than the alternative posed by Christians? And there have been various apologetic techniques to reduce the plausibility of admittedly fanciful explanations like this. So I've heard apologists say, for example, that the body couldn't have been taken by any mortal human being because the stone would have been too heavy to roll away. Well, look at the 15th chapter of Mark. It says pretty clearly that Joseph of Arimathea was able to seal the tomb shut, to roll the stone in front of the door, all alone. So, at the very least, certainly early Christians would have had the means to fake the resurrection event. But then it might be said, well, they wouldn't have had the motivation. Why would they make something like this up? Well, religious forgeries exist all the time. In every tradition in the world, you have sacred scripture invented by followers, written in the name of the founders of that faith. You have people going around claiming to have the bones of saints and things like this. So forgery is a very common feature of religious life, and certainly I find it very hard to believe that the people who originally followed Jesus were some special class of people who never would have lied for pious ends, who never would have exaggerated or misrepresented the facts to other people. They were ordinary human beings. They were ordinary believers, and like all believers at all times and all places throughout history, they would have had a kind of motivation to invent certain facts, to lie about certain things, and again, I'm not saying that's what they actually did, but I want to stress it is not outside the realm of possibility. And if the two best explanations that we have were that the resurrection was faked and the early followers of Jesus lied about it, or Jesus really was resurrected from the dead, I still find the first explanation, however fanciful, much more plausible than the second explanation. And secondly, there's a lot of mileage that apologists try to get from the fact that the earliest witnesses of the resurrection have traditionally been women, and this is cited as a significant fact, apparently, because in the old Jewish system, women were not viewed as reliable witnesses. So in a legal setting, for example, their testimony wouldn't be taken as seriously as the testimony of a man. So, the first observation to make here is that obviously this is not a legal setting, so I don't think the fact that the earliest witnesses being recorded as women has the kind of significance that a lot of Christians would like to attribute to it. The second problem is that, again, this is scarcely a universal tradition in the early Christian writings. So certainly Paul never mentions any women being witnesses to the resurrection, let alone the first witnesses. Mark suggests that women first witnessed the empty tomb, but they got scared, they didn't tell anyone. Mark also doesn't report the women experiencing the resurrection of Jesus, and even in something like the Gospel of Luke, so the women witness the resurrected Jesus, they go to tell people and no one believes them. So it's not exactly clear what kind of significance we should be attaching to the fact that women were supposedly the first witnesses of the resurrection of Jesus, because it doesn't really have any particular relevance to later Christian tradition. Jesus appeared to the rest of his followers in time anyway, so it's not like anything of great value hinges on the fact that the first witnesses were women. But I think now we're starting to get into the territory of Craig's second fact, and that is that, quote, on separate occasions, different individuals and groups of people saw appearances of Jesus alive after his death, end quote. So the mere fact that resurrection appearances are reported in the Gospels does not really tell us how seriously we should take these as historical accounts. So the first problem to note is that once again, the earliest sources that we have do not mention any specific resurrection appearances. So there's no resurrection appearances at the end of the Gospel of Mark. There's no resurrection appearances in the Gospel of Q. So these can be explained perhaps. Q was a sayings gospel, so why would it have mentioned the resurrection appearances? The Gospel of Mark has this theme of secrecy running throughout it, so perhaps his decision not to include resurrection appearances was a kind of artistic choice, let's say. But I think that the silence of resurrection appearances in the writings of Paul is once again pretty difficult to understand. So we have exactly the same issue that I mentioned before, that Paul was writing to the Corinthians specifically on the topic of the nature of the resurrection. The Corinthians, for whatever reason, didn't understand exactly what the resurrection involved. But if there were these stories about Jesus walking around and talking to people and eating with people and allowing people to, finger his wounds, then why didn't Paul think to mention it? In this case, that would be a very good demonstration of what is meant by a bodily resurrection. And indeed, why were the Corinthians not familiar with these traditions? If you had heard these stories about Jesus walking around as a kind of flesh and blood individual, or at least indistinguishable from a flesh and blood individual, why would you have this sort of ambiguity about what the resurrection involves? Now, it is true that Paul does appear to record a pretty early tradition about resurrection appearances. So this comes from 1 Corinthians, and most scholars are in agreement that this is not Paul's original formulation, that this is some early kerygma in the Christian church that he is relating. So this probably does represent a very early tradition about resurrection appearances in the early Christian community. And this is from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 to 8. And Paul writes here, quote, "For I handed on to you as of first importance what I in turn had received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he also appeared to me." End quote. So, a couple of important things to note here. Although this is an early tradition, although it clearly states that there were, let's say, resurrection appearances within the early church, there's a couple of weird features of this passage that, really deserve to be taken note of. So the first thing is that this particular sequence of events that Paul records here is not recorded anywhere else. So particularly this reference to the 500, this does not appear anywhere else in the New Testament, so it's unclear who these 500 people are. The sequence of resurrection appearances is at odds with the gospel accounts, so in the gospel accounts, as Craig mentions, it's typically the women who are the first to have an appearance from Jesus, but here Paul makes no mention of women. It is Peter who is the first one to experience the resurrected Christ. And This might be something of a minor point, but the way that Paul talks about these appearances, so it's translated as Jesus appeared to these various people, but interestingly, in the original Greek, it uses a kind of passive construction, so it would be something like Jesus was seen by X, or Jesus was made visible to X. And what I would stress here is that this is a kind of strange construction. If we are assuming these very vivid resurrection appearances that appear in the gospel accounts, that's sort of a strange way to phrase it. The way that Paul phrases it doesn't strike me as denoting a kind of very vivid resurrection experience with Jesus really walking around and talking to people. It's the kind of construction that a newly converted Christian might use. So a Christian might say, Jesus appeared to me and I became a Christian. But obviously, the kind of experience they have is typically not going to be as vivid as the kind of descriptions that are mentioned in the Gospels. So again, if there are these accounts of Jesus walking around like a human being circulating in the early Christian community, this sounds like, to me, a pretty strange way to phrase the whole thing. And we should also be clear that Paul is pretty vague about what his own experience of the resurrected Christ was like. So, paradigmatically, of course, we have this conversion experience on the road to Damascus where Jesus appears to Paul and says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? This is the account that appears in the book of Acts, but Paul never mentions such a vivid resurrection experience. So my argument here is that we don't have any real evidence for these vivid resurrection experiences in the early Christian community until we get to the Gospels of Matthew, Luke, and John, which are, written at the earliest date, probably at around 80 AD. So this is 50 years after the death of Jesus. But the earlier sources, so Paul, Mark, and the hypothetical Gospel of Q, they make no mention of these very vivid resurrection experiences. And to me, I think this is a little bit difficult to explain, because if these resurrection appearances were well known within the Christian community, that seems like the kind of thing that you would mention. It would be a very easy way to enhance the credibility of the resurrection, which apparently, as Paul's writings indicate, some Christians were struggling with. It would give a very vivid indication of what the resurrection actually involved, which, as we've said, is also something that apparently at least the Corinthians were struggling with. So why aren't these experiences mentioned, that even in passing, in the earliest sources we have in the New Testament? And even when we come to the resurrection accounts in the three Gospels, it can't escape our notice that these appearances do not perfectly align. So you can make them compatible. You can say that the Gospel authors were relating different accounts of different resurrection appearances, or that they were putting, a different spin on the same resurrection appearances, but there are pretty clear differences there. And so I think it would be something of an optimistic interpretation of the historical record, to say the very least, to suggest that the resurrection of Jesus as an historical event is vouchsafed by these eyewitness or so-called eyewitness testimonies, because the fact is they come pretty late in the historical record. They are not mentioned by the earliest sources. They are somewhat contradictory, and of course there are pretty clear theological motivations for later authors to invent these stories. And again, we don't have to assume anything pernicious here. We don't have to assume that they were lying, but this is a pretty natural thing in the development of biographies of venerated religious figures. So we can see it in relation to Muhammad, in relation to Buddha, in relation to a variety of other figures. even in the contemporary world, such as Baha'u'llah, Satyasai Baba, who we talked about in our episode on new religious movements. All of these figures, very rapidly after their deaths, had a kind of mythology built up around them, in which special powers were attributed to them. In some of these cases, many of these figures were attributed a divine status or a very close relationship with God. And so it's not particularly surprising that the early Christian community would have developed stories about the resurrection appearances, given that they believed in the resurrection of Jesus, and given that they are a religious community, much the same as any other religious community, that is going to be engaged in myth building over time, that stories are going to develop, that they're going to be passed on if they are particularly interesting. And, there's nothing mysterious about that. It's a very natural development in the history of all religious traditions. So the mere fact that the Gospels say that Jesus appeared to his followers, I think it's pretty clear that this is of very limited historical value, and it's certainly not enough to suggest that the actual historical resurrection of Jesus is the best explanation for all of this data. And the third fact that Craig cites here, namely, quote, "The original disciples suddenly came to believe in the resurrection of Jesus despite having every predisposition to the contrary," end quote. I mean, that is just complete nonsense. That is absolutely wrong. So, first of all, plainly, Jesus was teaching in the coming kingdom of God. This was an eschatological belief that was married to a belief in a general resurrection. And there was nothing special about Jesus in this regard. Similar beliefs were circulating amongst other Jewish groups at the time. So we can certainly imagine that the earliest followers of Jesus had a very strong commitment to this cause, a very strong belief in the coming resurrection and the coming kingdom of God. And we know from the gospel accounts that they had invested a lot of time and effort into this cause. They are depicted as leaving their families. They are depicted as having to live in hiding, it seems, and escaping the authorities. So they put a lot of time and effort into this cause. They must have believed very strongly in these key concepts. So there is nothing in the universe less surprising than the fact that the earliest followers of Jesus came to see him as a resurrected quasi-divine figure. It's perfectly natural that they would come to view it this way. And again, there's nothing speculative about this. When we study religious movements in the contemporary world, you see exactly the same sort of dynamics, that when the original promises of a particular religious leader do not pan out, or that religious leader dies, there is a very rapid process of what we might call a kind of apotheosis of this leader after death, a transformation of this leader into a quasi-divine figure. And, it's perfectly natural if you have a group of people who have invested a lot of time and resources into a particular religious program. They're not just going to suddenly abandon that and think, oh, okay, that was a bit of fun, time to move on to something else. Once the leader, passes on, rather they tend to double down on their beliefs, and they tend to develop a whole host of other beliefs which serve to justify, again, the time and the effort that they have put into this cause. And I think my favorite example of this is the case of the group that was founded by the Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, who was a 20th century rabbi of a Hasidic sect in Judaism. And he became a very popular religious figure. He was a figure who preached the coming arrival of a particular Messiah, although it's a little bit unclear whether he ever adopted that label for himself. But he was a very charismatic figure. He inspired a great number of people. He was widely venerated, not just within this particular Jewish sect, but within the wider Jewish community as a great teacher, as an inspirational leader, and so on. And he died in the year 1994. And after his death, you started getting a lot of very strange claims being made by various Hasidic Jews who were previously part of his sect. And in many cases, they were reporting very vivid resurrection experiences of this rabbi, that the rabbi would come to them and make very concrete pronouncements about what they were to do with their lives, the kinds of messages they were to give to the rest of the community, and so on. And there was even a small faction of this group who came to believe in the total apotheosis of this rabbi. So they literally believed that he was deified after death and associated him with the creator of the universe. Now, for an Orthodox Jewish group to be making these kinds of pronouncements is extremely unusual, and they received a lot of flack for this from other Orthodox groups. There were a number of Jewish people who condemned these sort of beliefs and practices as not properly Jewish, and I hope here that you can see some similarities. So, in the case of Jesus, it's often said that the Jews of the time wouldn't have invented a figure like Jesus, that it would have been blasphemous for ordinary Jews to make the kinds of claims about Jesus that they did, and therefore, there is no way that they would have made this stuff up. But we can see exactly the same practice happening amongst Orthodox Jews today. There are a small contingent who believe that this rabbi was the Messiah, that he is appearing to people after his death, and as I've said, even a small minority of that group who believe him to be the creator of the universe. The parallels here are uncanny. But again, there's nothing mysterious about this process. When you have invested so much time and emotion and effort into a particular cause, when the person responsible for leading this cause dies, the followers don't just abandon the cause, but rather, as I've said, they double down on their beliefs, they start constructing an elaborate web of justifications for why this cause can continue. They start to treat the leader of this group not just as an inspirational individual, but as a kind of divine force in his own right. And this is a pattern that has been repeated many, many times throughout history. So again, if you presume that the followers of Jesus already believed in a resurrection, already believed in a coming kingdom of God in which Jesus was going to play a key role, it was basically inevitable that they would come to believe that he was resurrected. Now, in the case of this 20th century rabbi that I mentioned, we can look at those resurrection experiences and we can ask, well, are these authentic or not? How do we judge whether or not these people are just lying or making it up? But it's not that simple. Plainly, they were having very vivid experiences of this resurrected rabbi. Plainly, they would feel that they have strong reasons for deifying him in this sense. But that is not to say that we have to take their experiences seriously. If we take every religious experience that someone has as possible evidence for their religious claims, then we would have to believe in a world filled with magic, because these sorts of claims are made about men and women all over the world every single day, and they can't all be gods, they can't all really be messiahs, they can't all really be resurrected from the dead. Some people here must simply be mistaken. And I think it's interesting to ask how it is that people are mistaken. That would be a topic for another day. We would have to get back into the topic of, the cognitive science of religion and so on to explain what it might be at the cognitive level, which motivates these sort of extraordinary beliefs. But the fact is, it appears to be perfectly natural. We don't have to invoke a supernatural explanation to explain any of these things. It just seems to be a very common pattern in how religions develop. So here, the fact that the earliest followers of Jesus came to believe firstly in his resurrection and then subsequently in his divinity, that is, in fact, exactly what we would expect to see. Based on our studies of new religious movements, this is exactly the kind of dynamics that exist within these kind of sectarian groups. But perhaps Craig was suggesting this fact for a different reason, so maybe his claim is not that it would have been very unlikely for Jews of Jesus' time to come up with these ideas about him, but rather that they wouldn't have persisted in these sort of beliefs given all the persecution that they faced. So this is another very common apologetic line that the earliest Christians must have believed very sincerely in the resurrection of Jesus because they were willing to risk life and limb for these beliefs, and they wouldn't have done that unless they had a very strong reason to believe that Jesus was in fact resurrected. Now, again, this has absolutely no correlation to what we see in the real world, to the real world dynamics of religious groups. The fact is, even today, everywhere around the world, you can find groups of people who are persecuted for their religious beliefs, and very, very rarely does this cause them to abandon their beliefs. In fact, in many cases, persecution can be taken as a sign of virtue, of their own righteousness, of their suffering for a good cause, and actually persecution can serve to strengthen their beliefs. So if you take the Ahmadiyya movement, for example, in Pakistan, this is a messianic group within the Islamic tradition. So they believe in someone called Ahmad who lived in the 19th century, was the Messiah, and basically they are persecuted for this. So they are deemed heretical by mainstream Islamic Sunni groups. They are denounced by the Pakistani government as an heretical group, as not a true representation of Islam. So they face persecution from the government as well. They are stripped of certain rights, and yet they persist in their beliefs. And again, I hope the parallel here is very clear. Just like the early Christians, they are persecuted by the state, they are denounced by their co-religionists, and yet they persist in their beliefs. But does that really mean that there must be some truth to Ahmad's claim of being the Messiah? Does that mean that the rest of us have to take this claim seriously, that there must be a kernel of historical truth there for the Ahmadis to persist in this belief? Of course not. That's just how religion works. It generates very strong emotional connections to particular concepts. It generates what we have termed sacred values in an earlier episode. If you go back to the episode on the nature of religious groups, you can see how important these sacred values are to the construction and the stability of a religious group. And that's exactly what has happened in the case of the Ahmadis in Pakistan. That is exactly what happened with the earliest Christians. Sure, they faced persecution, they faced ostracism, they suffered for their beliefs, but that has never been a reason in the history of religion for someone to abandon their religious beliefs. But at the same time, it also doesn't somehow make those beliefs more credible. if you want to argue that the claims of the earliest Christians must be credible because they were willing to suffer for it, you must also accept that there must be some truth to the claims of Ahmad. You must be willing to claim that there is some truth to the claims of Baha'u'llah in the Baha'i faith, because they've also suffered a lot in Iran and other parts of the Middle East for their beliefs. You would have to say that there must be some truth to Scientology, because these poor bastards get laughed at and demonized every day, and yet they persist in their beliefs. So, again, the mere fact that Christians suffered for their beliefs is not a reason to believe that those beliefs must have been informed by some reliable historical event. Okay, and so now we arrive at Craig's eighth and final argument for the existence of God, and that is that, quote, God can be personally known and experienced, end quote. And this is how he explains this argument.
This isn't really an argument for God's existence. Rather, it's the claim that you can know that God exists wholly apart from arguments, simply by personally experiencing Him. Philosophers call beliefs like this properly basic beliefs. They aren't based on some other beliefs. Rather, they're part of the foundations of a person's system of beliefs. Other properly basic beliefs would be belief in the reality of the past or the existence of the external world. In the same way, belief in God is, for those who seek Him, a properly basic belief grounded in our experience of God.
Okay, so what Craig is basically doing here is playing very fast and loose with this term basic belief. So this term basic belief has existed in philosophy for quite a while. It refers to a kind of belief which cannot find any kind of external justification, but which appears to be necessary for other kinds of beliefs to be plausible. So, for example, the belief that the external world really exists, it's going to be very difficult to find a definitive justification for this claim because, as Descartes showed, any kind of evidence that we present from our sensory experience could just be dismissed as a hallucination. So there is no absolute way to know that the external world exists, and yet it appears to be a necessary belief in order for other beliefs that we hold to ring true. So if, for example, I reject the existence of an external world, then basically everything in my life, every belief that I hold, becomes an impossibility. I can't believe that the Earth goes around the sun because the external world doesn't exist. I can't go and eat a sandwich for lunch because I don't believe that the external world exists. So this is a basic belief because it's basically impossible to justify, but it's a kind of universally held belief that all human beings must really accept on faith, if you want to use that word, in order for a multitude of other beliefs, of other activities that we do, to be plausible. So what some Christian philosophers have attempted to do in recent years, led in this case by Alvin Plantinga, is to develop a philosophical program that they refer to as Reformed epistemology, which attempts to make the argument that belief in God is a basic belief of this sort. And you can understand pretty quickly why this might be a useful philosophical argument for them to make, because if they can identify God as a properly basic belief, then it means, firstly, they don't need to further justify their belief in God any more than anyone else needs to justify their belief that the past exists. And it also presents belief in God as one of these sort of obvious, intuitive beliefs that really everyone should be able to arrive at. So we don't need to be taught that the past exists, that's just something we can intuit from our experience of the world. And in the same way, we don't need to be taught that God exists. the existence of God is just something we can intuit, again, from personal experience. But the problem here should be obvious, and that is that belief in God is not a properly basic belief in the same way that belief in the external world or a belief in the past are basic beliefs. So, firstly, belief in God is not really necessary to hold a wide range of other beliefs about the world. So, if you can imagine someone who really claimed to be a true solipsist, they really believed only in their own existence, they did not believe in the existence of an external world, they did not believe in the existence of the past. If they really tried to live by those beliefs, their life would be impossible. They would stay in bed all day staring at the ceiling until they eventually starved to death because, things like food and water are obviously just illusions. So if you were to properly live out those beliefs, if you were to reject the basic beliefs of the existence of the external world, say, then life would be impossible. So the only way for a solipsist to get on in the world is to live as though the external world really exists. But if they are living their entire lives as though the external world really exists, then I would call into question their belief that the external world doesn't, in fact, exist in the first place. Because if you are living as though the external world exists, then in a very real sense, I think, you are living with the belief that the external world exists. But if you contrast that to someone who believes in God, and they come to reject this belief in God later on, this might be a traumatic experience for them. They might have to revise their worldview in, a fairly intimate way, but otherwise, other beliefs that they have about the world are not going to be threatened or challenged by the rejection of this belief in God. And in fact, what you very often find is that when people reject God, when people become atheists, of course they are going to revise their moral beliefs, let's say. They're going to revise what they see as their meaning or purpose in life, of course. But other beliefs about the world are not going to change. They are still going to believe that the Earth goes around the sun. They're still going to believe that if they're hungry, they can make a sandwich. They're still going to believe that this and that bus leaves at this and that time. Nothing else really changes. So, God is not a properly basic belief in this sense because it's not as though we reject God that our entire belief system has to completely collapse in the same way that it would if we rejected something like the existence of the external world. And the belief in God is also not properly basic in the sense that it's not really universal. That is, it doesn't seem to be a key aspect of human cognition. So with respect to something like the belief in the external world, so of course you do get particular philosophical and religious traditions which reject the existence of the external world. So in Buddhism and Hinduism, you get this concept of Maya, that the external world is a kind of illusion. But even here, people who adhere to those particular beliefs do not really live as though they are true. So a Hindu or a Buddhist who subscribes to this belief feels thirsty and you offer them a glass of water, they're not going to dismiss it and say, no, that glass of water is just an illusion. They wouldn't get very far with that. So, in a sense, their worldly practices indicate at least the belief that we should act as though the external world exists, which, as I said, I think is basically equivalent to the belief that the external world exists. But anyway, ignoring these fringe cases, you can go basically any time, any culture, throughout history, and you are going to find people who have these beliefs that the past exists, that the external world is real, and so on. They appear to be a core facet of the human experience. It's going to be very difficult to live a human life without these beliefs. But the problem is that the belief in the kind of God that Plantinga and Craig and other Christians believe in is really an aberrant belief by historical standards. There have not been very many people throughout history who have believed in an omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, omnibenevolent God who is also a personal agent. And so I did some quick Googling on this, and Google suggests that approximately 117 billion human beings have ever walked the face of this earth, and it also estimates that approximately 7 to 10 billion people have ever been members of the Abrahamic faiths. So that means 6 to 9% of people throughout history have held the kind of beliefs about God that Plantinga does. And I know that there are obviously many other religious traditions that also believe in very powerful gods, but it's not really the same God that Plantinga and other members of the Abrahamic faiths believe in. So if you're looking for something that is going to count as a basically universal religious belief, you're going to be looking at things like a belief in magic, so that is the belief in unseen causal powers in the world. This is basically universal around the world. Same with things like witchcraft, same with things like evil eye as a religious concept, same with things like the belief in the continued existence of ancestors who need to be placated to ensure that they don't walk around as angry ghosts. These are beliefs that you find in basically every culture, even in today's Western culture to an extent, throughout the entirety of history. So if we are looking for properly basic beliefs in the sense that they appear to be incredibly integral to human cognition, these are what are going to count as properly basic in that sense. Every culture seems to have required some kind of belief in concepts like this. Yet, obviously, I think Craig and Plantinga are going to reject the existence of magic, they're going to reject the existence of evil eye, they're going to reject, I would hope, witchcraft, and they are going to reject the existence of hungry ghosts. But if they are suggesting that the majority of humanity has been wrong in the orientation of their religious beliefs, then what does it say about these supposedly basic beliefs of Plantinga, Craig, and so on? Because it seems like you're going to have to argue that someone's basic religious intuitions are very, very wrong in this case, and I don't know what it says about Christian beliefs that very few people throughout history have ever held them. That has to be a kind of problem for anyone who is arguing that a Christian belief in a God is going to be a basic belief. But even if we put it the other way around, that it's the Christians who are right, and to believe in this supreme God, this personal agent who serves as the ground of all being, that this is the properly basic belief, then what does it say about the cognitive faculties of humanity that more than 90% of the world's population throughout history has never been able to arrive at these beliefs? If these sorts of beliefs are properly basic, how were they able to get through their day? Well, self-evidently they were able to get through their day without belief in this sort of God, so plainly these sorts of beliefs are not properly basic in the sense that they are necessary for a wealth of other beliefs which make human life possible. Now, as for the reliability of religious experiences as a good reason to believe in the existence of God, again, this is a topic that I think deserves an entire episode on its own. So, in a previous episode, I have touched on the rhetoric of religious experience, so there the focus was not really on whether we can count religious experiences as reliable insights into the nature of reality, but rather how it is that believers frame their experiences. But even there, I think there's this important observation that religious experiences are dubious to the extent that they are typically framed by the particular concepts that an individual has, and that these concepts are central to the experience, and that if we reduce the religious experience to its pure phenomenological data, that they are actually radically ambiguous in nature. So someone might feel a surge of energy, and they will say, I felt the Holy Spirit flow through me. Well, almost the entirety of that experience is being structured by the particular concept that the person holds. If they did not previously have this concept of the Holy Spirit, and if they hadn't previously vested this concept with a degree of credulity, then they simply wouldn't be able to interpret the experience in that way. Feeling a rush of energy or joy through your body is an otherwise radically ambiguous experience. And so that is precisely why we find that the religious experiences that people have around the world tend to conform very neatly with the kinds of religious experiences that their peers are having, and that they tend to be framed and expressed in the idiom of the religion with which they are most familiar. So, to put it simply, Christians have very Christian religious experiences, Buddhists have very Buddhist religious experiences, Taoists have very Taoist religious experiences, and so on. So, if, of course, religious experiences are granting us some insight into reality at its very deepest levels, these sorts of discrepancies, I think, are very difficult to explain. You should find a much more universal set of religious experiences, but in practice, we don't find that. People in religious communities tend to have exactly the kinds of religious experiences that they have been conditioned to have. And to me, anyway, that is obviously much more consonant with this idea that religious experiences are a product of culture, a product of psychology, as opposed to genuinely reliable insights into the nature of reality. And yet again, even if you don't find these sorts of arguments convincing, it doesn't really matter, because once more, this sort of explanation, well, people are experiencing God because there really is a God, it doesn't explain anything. Or reframing religious experiences as basic beliefs also doesn't really explain anything. So yet again, we have this virtue of informativeness that every good explanation should possess, and these explanations, such that they are, explain literally nothing. So, suggesting that religious experiences really do originate with God fails to explain why people have such divergent religious experiences, why it is that people from non-theistic cultures do not seem to experience God, or, even more specifically, why don't they experience the resurrected Jesus, or very specific content like this. That never occurs. People always tend to have experiences, as we've said, that conform with the conceptual prejudices of the culture in which they live. It certainly fails to explain why it is that some people, like me, never seem to have any religious experiences at all. And most importantly for me, I think it also fails to explain why people who undergo religious experiences so rarely have anything particularly interesting or earth-shattering to report. So, if you think about it, you're communing with God, you are accessing reality at its deepest levels. Tell me something interesting about this. So I know that, of course, a lot of religious people will say that these experiences are ineffable, That is a bit of a cop-out. Again, go back to my earlier episode on the rhetoric of religious experience to understand why that really isn't the case. They actually tend to be pretty loquacious about their religious experiences at times, but nothing that they relate to people is of any genuinely earth-shattering value. So certainly they don't come back from their experience with any useful testable claims about the world. So no one ever comes back and says, yeah, there's going to be an earthquake tomorrow, so look out, and then the earthquake happens. Wow, okay, that's pretty useful information. Thank you for telling us. And even if you want to argue that it's somehow unfair to expect that religious experiences would have this sort of definite, testable, cognitive content, and, to which I could only argue, well, why not? Why wouldn't that be possible? But even if we say, okay, that's not what religious experiences are really like, even then, I don't find anything particularly interesting about it. So someone has a religious experience, they say, God gave me a feeling of peace in my heart and told me everything will be okay. Well, I mean, we can't learn anything about God from that sort of experience. We can't learn anything about the world. So what kind of epistemic value can these experiences really be said to have? Why would you attempt to use them as some kind of evidence for the existence of God when they are invariably so vague and so empty and so prosaic and so predictable that we really cannot learn anything useful from them? So those are the 8 arguments for the existence of God. As I said, my goal here was not to thoroughly debunk these claims. Craig has written a lot on all of these topics, so everything that I've said here, I'm sure he has some kind of response to. But at the same time, I think I've highlighted some pretty serious problems with these arguments for God. I certainly can't find any reason to take them seriously in the form that they have been presented here and in other public forums that Craig has aired them. So hopefully, yet again, there was something interesting to take from this episode. Thank you very much for listening. See you again next time. Bye-bye.